We are looking at a map of Europe in 1648. This is the year that the Treaty of Westphalia was signed, and this treaty tried to guarantee the kind of safety, the security, the peace between the Dutch Republic and the Spanish Netherlands. Now, conflict had been raging in this area for decades, with many treaties kind of thrown in there, like the Treaty of Antwerp, which tried again to create peace between the Spanish, who were Catholic, and these northern areas, which were Protestant. And so a lot of religious wars had gone on, political wars, conflicts, and interest. And so this had been a hotbed of war for just decades. And people were very, very tired of the conflict and the war. And so uneasy treaties were made in order to try and guarantee part of the peace. Now, Spain had owned a large portion of this area up here, and so the Dutch Republic actually is part of the territory that the Spanish used to own. This is not going to leave the two areas on easy terms, so there's going to be kind of this continuing conflict and a little bit of patriotism that's going to show up in kind of the paintings that we're going to look at. Now, within the Dutch Republic, this is going to be a Protestant area, and that means for art that we are not going to see a lot of religious art because the Protestants really did not champion religious imagery. Unlike the Catholics, which when you walk into a Catholic church, you're going to see an altarpiece and you're going to see images of the saints and maybe Mary. On the exterior of the churches, they're going to be highly decorated. The interior of the churches is going to be highly decorated. But the Protestants really believed in simplicity within the churches themselves. And so this causes a little bit of a problem for artists because the church and religious institutions like monasteries had been one of the major patrons for artists, and now that patron is gone. But in the Dutch Republic, they had started to have a very successful middle class, and so this rising middle class becomes very wealthy, and this rising middle class wants images for their homes, but they want very different types of images than what artists had traditionally been making. So as opposed to religious imagery or history paintings, images having to do with religion, mythology, history, large-scale, dramatic scenes, what people wanted in the Dutch Republic were genre scenes, interiors of houses, portraits, landscapes, still lifes. And so that's what we're going to mostly see when we look at the art of this area. Now, continuing on, we're going to look at an artist called Frans Hals, and he does a lot of the portraiture in this area, and we do start to see artists specializing in particular areas. So like Frans Hals, he does portraits. We'll have other artists that specialize in landscapes, like Van Ruysdael, or ones who specialize in still lifes, and sometimes it would be particular still lifes, like this artist is really good at flowers, and so they just do flowers. Or this artist is really good at vanitas scenes, and so they do just vanitas scenes. So you get very particular artists doing very particular artwork, so it's kind of interesting. So let's take a look at Frans Hals and his style. Now I'm going to take you through several of his pictures just so you can see what I'm talking about when I talk about an artist particularizing in a type of art. So here we've got all sorts of portraiture, group portraiture, singular portraiture. And what sometimes this middle class would actually want would be maybe a single portrait of the husband and a single portrait of the wife. Now, I'm not saying that these two are together, but you would often have kind of a singular image of the woman and a singular image of the man. You would also get family scenes like we see here. And as I scroll through, I want you to notice the dress of what people are wearing, especially for this kind of middle class, this upper middle class or the wealthy classes. So we see some more of this upper class, these beautiful collars that they're wearing. We do have some images that Frans Hals does of the lower classes as well, and you can notice a big difference between the dress of the people, and that will distinguish out kind of who you're looking at. Now, some of these people really wanted to look like fancy dandies, and I'm a man of style, which is kind of what we see over here. And then, if you've been noticing, the dress is primarily black with some sort of collar, and the collar kind of denotes a little bit of the time frame that we are talking about, because the collars could kind of tell you a little bit of the style. So we can think of like 70s style, 80s style, 90s style, and how styles of clothing changed. Well, here the collars that they're wearing tells us a little bit about the time period and the style that people were in. But black was primarily one of the colors that this wealthy upper class would wear. And so if you notice going all the way through, it's all very dark clothing. So if you look at some of the dates, all these are from the 1620s, 1630s. They've got the very big round collar that would have many, many folds. It would be one long piece of cloth that was then folded up, and so gives us something of the style for these people. Now I also want to show you some of the lower class images that Frans Hals did. Boys playing musical instruments, like this boy playing the flute, was very popular, was a genre type. We also get a lot of young boys blowing bubbles, was something that this wealthy class wanted a lot of. And then sometimes we get kind of moralizing or tavern scenes, which is kind of what we have here with Mali Baba. And in this, we're actually seeing something interesting as opposed to kind of a portrait like we saw over here of very respectable people who you can tell they are poised in a very particular way, or maybe they have some sort of attribute, like this woman is holding a book which says something of her education and status. That's not what we see here with Mali Baba. And apparently a historical character. She is at one point apparently committed to an insane asylum, and so Frans Hals is actually showing this very interesting, different side of life. We have this very upper class, pent up and kind of well put together in the way of Mali Baba that he does. Let's take a look at her close in though, because I want you to see something of his style, or something of the style that he's very well known for. Now, one of the things I want you to notice is look at her collar and look at her bonnet, and then the round portion of the top of her drinking cup, and in her clothes. It's very loose. He has painted this in a very loose, painterly manner. It is unlike most of the artwork we have seen up until this point. So if you think back to Gentileschi painting we looked at, Judith and Holofernes, and we zoomed in really close to look at the style, it was very slick. You could not see her brushwork. It was hidden. That's not what Frans Hals is doing. And especially kind of as he gets on in age, his works have a tendency to be much more loose, much more painterly. And you can really tell he has a command of the paint itself. So I'm actually going to go in a little bit closer. Now this is one of those marks when you start to look at artists and you really want to know how good an artist is. Look at, say, like these lines. These lines are not kind of re-put in. It's not like he went in and corrected this multiple times, which you can do with oil paint. You can cover up your mistake, you can go back in, you can repaint it if you want, and it's very hard to tell when you're working on a slick canvas. Or a very tightly painted canvas to be able to tell that. But when an artist is working very loose like this, you can see that he has just an absolute command of where he is putting that paint down, and that really shows just how good he is to know where do I need to put the paint and what color do I need to put it in at. And in one brush stroke, he just puts this black squiggle in. One brush stroke, he puts that in. And if you notice, it's not just the application of paint, but it is also the void of paint, the lack of paint that he is using to create this look. So he's not really even painting in the whole color. All this in here is just kind of background color, and he's just smacking in a few dashes of paint that gives our eye enough information to fill in the rest, and we make that color whole. One of the things with Frans Hals is he's really well known for doing this with hands. That the hands are almost just slap-dashed together, kind of like Mali's face here, where you can really see every single stroke and he doesn't fill in the whole hand. But he was very, very popular and people loved his paintings and wanted his paintings. Now the other thing that we see during this time period are group portraitures, kind of the type of group portraiture that you might see for Board of Trustees. That's what this type of a painting is, and he does a lot of different types of these massive group portraits, and this is a type at this time. Many, many people wanted the group portraits. I'm just going to flip over here for a second so you can see all these different types of group portraits. Here, that Board of Trustees kind of look that I was talking about. Here are the different military group portraits. This is Rembrandt's Night Watch, and we'll actually look and talk about that in depth a little later. But I wanted you to see that this is a type, and people wanted to have this type of an image. Now, with this image, I do want you to know that this is a very kind of like democratic type of a scene, in that each person who was in this had to pay to have themselves put in. And so it's not just one person putting up the money for the portrait or the institution putting up the money for the portrait. Each individual person actually put it up. And what we're actually seeing here is a group of militiamen. And because of all the fighting that had been happening for just decades, you had standing militias within cities. And once peace comes, these standing militias kind of start to become more like drinking, dining clubs where they would get together and you can see all their weaponry and they would bring their weaponry and kind of celebrate together the victories that they had had. And it becomes kind of a social thing, where before it really was, we're part of a standing militia and we might actually really have to defend our city, to these kind of social clubs. And that's kind of more in the realm of what we're seeing here. And these are the archers of St. Hadrian's. And so each one of these guys actually paid to have their portrait put in. And from what we understand, the more money you paid, the better position in the composition you got. So maybe you didn't really care, but you wanted to be in the portrait, but you didn't want to pay a lot of money. You might get, a back position back here somewhere where it's just your head. And as we move through, the ones who really thought highly of themselves or had the money to pay or maybe had a prominent position within this militia group might pay a little bit more. So if the captain or lieutenant or something like that was going to be in the portrait, he might pay a little bit more, so he'd have a more prominent position. But again, you can see they're all wearing that black. They've got on different collars, but they are all very beautifully rendered. They're wearing parts of their colors. They've got their weapons that they would hold, the swords, the halberds, and things of that nature. Now, Frans starts to mess with the traditional lineup of what a group portrait like this would actually look like. And so he's kind of grouping men in this kind of loose fashion. And so the styles, even for these group portraits, start to change. Before, it'd be kind of like, kindergarten pictures where they all make you kind of like line up and the ones in the front have to kneel, and then maybe the second row stands and the row in the back is either the really tall people or they're on a riser, and it's just the standard lineup. Frans Hals wanted to do something a little bit more interesting, and the artist of this time period wanted to do something a little bit more interesting, and so we've got this kind of grouping mechanism that he uses. Now, when we look at Rembrandt's Night Watch, we're going to see that Rembrandt just says, to heck with tradition, I'm doing something completely different, much more interesting than anything anyone else has done. And so this is Frans Hals. I want you to know him as an expert in this kind of portraiture, or singular portraiture, and then also for his loose brushwork, because that is almost a tall tale sign that you are looking at a Frans Hals. If you ever make it over to Sarasota and you go to the Ringling Museum, they have a great Frans Hals there, and you can absolutely see this style. He's one of those artists when you go in and you're looking at artwork and you see this kind of very loose painterly brushwork and you're looking at a portrait, you can almost call it. You can almost say, that has to be a Frans Hals. So I suggest maybe you try and quiz yourself like that if you find yourself in a section of the museum that has Northern Baroque art. See if you can't pick out the Frans Hals.